on your, and just let me grab your questions. Fantastic. Dr. Tim Sharp, welcome back to the podcast. It is lovely to see your face again. How have you been since we last chatted?
Oh, thanks again for having me. I think we were just chatting off air. It's been a few years. So, well, a lot's happened since then. How have I been? All over the place.
Good. And quite possibly the most important question for our conversation. What's your coffee order when I can finally buy you that coffee that I think 3 years ago I said I would and I still haven't?
Well, it's a difficult question. I have two coffee orders. So
Right.
sorry to complicate things. I mostly drink long black, but if I feel like something a little bit different, I'll have a flat white.
Fantastic. And a book that you have read, it could be within your expertise or more broadly, that has caused you to stop and reconsider a few things in your life.
It also a bit, I'd hate to be difficult, but it's also a bit hard to answer. As you can see, I actually love reading, so I read a lot. And when I first saw that question, I thought, well, do you mean professionally or personally? Because I read a lot of fiction in my private time and obviously a lot of nonfiction for my work. So if nonfiction, well, there were many, many books, but I suppose the one that stands out, I suppose, was Marty Seligman's first book called on positive psychology, which is Authentic Happiness, which is a bit dated now, and it's been, there's been much probably better and more recent books. But for me, that certainly changed the trajectory of my career, I suppose. So in a sense, it was very influential for me. Personally, as I said, I've read hundreds or probably thousands of novels. But again, if I think of the most profound ones, well, I remember when I was very, very young, discovering reading The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, where things got me really excited about fiction and fantasy, I suppose. And then when I was a bit more, a little bit older, Catcher in the Rye was one that sort of stands out as a teenager, something that kind of really, I suppose it was a bit like getting a slap across the face, I suppose, something that really made me think, possibly for the first time as an adolescent. And then since then, there have been hundreds and hundreds, too many to name.
That's great. I love hearing people's eclectic book recommendations. I mean, this podcast is proving quite expensive. I mean, there's continual flow of new books into my house. So thank you for costing me a little bit of money today. I really appreciate that. My wife won't, but I appreciate your recommendations. If you could have a dinner party with anybody, obviously your family isn't included in the head count. Who would you love to sit down and share a meal with?
Well, again, I'm going to be difficult and say really the only people that would matter would be my wife and children. I know that's probably not what you want to hear, or maybe it's too cliched, but really, they're sort of first, second, and third with a long, long way after that. I know what people are probably supposed to answer that with famous people or inspirational heroes, but to be honest, I've been lucky enough to meet some famous people. And they're not necessarily as impressive as we think they're often going to be. I don't mean that to be rude in any way, but look, really, for me, it would come down to my wife and children. And then maybe I've got a small group of very good friends who I enjoy spending time with.
Amazing. I saw an Instagram video a little while ago, and it was asking kids who they would love to sit down and share a meal with, and all of them said their family. And it just reminded me that every night I get to do that, and some days it's chaotic. Some days there's a kid has a tantrum, but for me, they would be my favorite people, and they are my favorite people to spend time with. So I think that is a wonderful answer. So tell me about Marnie, Tali, and Kobe. What do they mean to you, and why did you decide to dedicate your recent book, Lost and Found, to them?
So just to be clear, Marnie's my wife, Tully and Kobe are my two children. And I suppose, as I just answered to the previous question, they're pretty much everything to me. They're the most important people in my life. As I think I've talked about before, and certainly as I write about in my book, despite being known as Dr. Happy, I've been very unhappy through much of my life. I've experienced quite significant mental ill health, mostly depression and anxiety. And to be honest, I'm not sure I'd be here today talking to you if it wasn't for them. They're my reason for living. They've given me clarity through the darkest of dark times. And more as my children get a bit older, to be perfectly honest, they're my inspiration. It's really amazing to see the people they're growing into, and fills me with love and pride most of the time, not necessarily every minute, but
Yeah.
it really is amazing to think that my wife and I created these human beings who are
Mm.
now doing some amazing things.
I know my daughter, who I think you might have met 3 years ago, and she would have been tiny. She is about to turn 7 and is going into year 2 next year of school. And the things that she teaches me are amazing. I just look at her and think, how on earth are you 50% me? Because you inspire me in ways that I've never thought possible. And my other one, who is completely different, who is like a wombat or a Tassie devil. That's probably a better way of describing it. She just causes chaos everywhere. But she's the most beautiful little human. And I know parents are biased, but I just think they're the best people in the world. It's crazy. Yeah.
Well, look, I think, and again, I know it's a bit cliche, but for me anyway, and I think for a lot of people, as you said, parenting's not always easy. There's no doubt about it. It's certainly not all rainbows and unicorns and smiles and happiness. But for me, and parenting is definitely, without a doubt, provided perspective, and a perspective that there's something more. There's other people more than just me. There's no doubt. Yeah, I guess like a lot of people, that when I was younger, I was selfish. I think we all are to some extent. But, when you get married, or you don't have to get married, I suppose, but when you have children, you need to, or most of us decide to take on that level of responsibility, which means forces you to think outside of yourself. And that's actually a crucial ingredient to a certain type of happiness. I think the other thing that comes from parenting, again, like you said, in a way, my two children are quite different. They're quite different personalities. Well, it's a boy and a girl, but they're also quite different personalities. And I think what it does is it sort of invites you or encourages you to look for the best in other people, even where there are differences, which is something that we can probably all learn from and extend beyond our immediate family.
Mm. And I'm just wondering, Tim, just a little bit of advice, because I know you are in very high demand as a speaker and as a teacher and as an academic. How do you make sure that you keep the main thing the main thing? Because I'm sure that you would have invitations all of the time to travel and speak and appear on TV shows and podcasts. How do you make sure that you are keeping the right things in check?
Well, I'll start by saying I don't get it right all the time. and I suppose in some ways, I'll get in my first plug for my book, Lost and Found. That's partly what
Absolutely.
Lost and Found's about. We all get lost at times, and we all get it wrong sometimes. We all fail and we fall over. And so in answer to your question, look, I don't get it right all the time, and I certainly haven't got it right. There have been times, but probably particularly earlier when I was a lot busier. I guess I'm at a luckier stage now where I've got more control and I can say no to things. But certainly when I was really busy, when my profile and business was taking off, and I was flying all over the country regularly, and I was away from home probably more than I wanted to be. So yeah, I haven't got it right all the time. I don't get it right. No one gets it right all the time. But I guess for me, it hasn't been that difficult because they are so important to me. And so the times when I have strayed and lost focus, I suppose, I've been brought back pretty quickly by the realization that I'm nothing without them really, or nothing matters without them.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm reminded every day that my kids could not care less what I do. All they're interested in is dad home to read a story, or is dad pack my lunch for school. And it's incredibly humbling, I think, to realize that that you're exactly right, that your whole purpose and your whole reason for being is because of them. And I sometimes I find myself taking for granted those relationships because I know they'll always be there. So I think for me, taking a little bit of time just to remember that they are so important and they are so special. And I just, yeah, it's a really good lesson, I think, for what matters most, is you look into the eyes of your kids and yeah.
And that being said, and just to clarify, I suppose I do think it's not all about them, because I think part of being a good father,
Yeah.
or mother, parent for whatever, is actually leading a life that sets an example for them.
Yeah.
So it's not about necessarily being with them, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, pandering to every whim, because part of what I want to be as a father is a good role model to show that, if you work hard, you can achieve things, and that There are other things that matter in my life, and that my wife's had a career as well as being a mother. So, I think yes, I agree with what you're saying, but it's it can be mistaken sometimes. I misunderstood thinking that we should devote every minute of every day just to taking care of whatever our kids need. Well, not necessarily. There's a bit of balance there.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think initially when I had kids, I was really afraid of them seeing dad working. And I think now I'm a lot more open to, like, at the moment, my daughter's watching a movie, my wife's working from home. So it's actually quite important for them to see, as you're quite rightly saying, actually seeing your parents achieving things that are really important to them and going after the things that matter. So I think that's a really good clarification there. So for those people that are not familiar with your work, and I'll link to your episode, I think in season 1, so 3 years ago, so people can listen to that. But for those of people that are not familiar with your work, give me a little bit of a brief history of your career in education and why and how are you known as Dr. Happy?
Well, the brief version is I started out many years ago now, several decades ago now, on the path to become a clinical psychologist. So for those who aren't familiar, clinical psychology is, I guess that's what most people think about. I was working towards and training towards being a therapist. So I did my undergrad degree and an honours degree, and then a clinical master's degree, which is the training, practical training. But I learned, I realized fairly early on, under the influences of a man who eventually became my mentor, that I actually wanted to be a clinical academic. And so what that means is, so then after my master's degree, I did a PhD, and I eventually became a clinical academic, which meant I was a therapist, lecturer, and researcher. So, you've got a foot in all camps. And to be perfectly honest, I had my dream job in a fantastic team in a fantastic clinic very early on. I was literally living the perfect life for me, professional life for me. But then to cut a long story short, I surprised everyone, including myself, for a variety of reasons, by leaving that and going off into private practice, which is not something I'd ever thought of really much before then. And again, I surprised everyone at the time, but it turned out to be, well, it was meant to be a short-term thing. And then I accidentally made a success of it, and turned out to be a long-term venture where my small private practice turned into this thriving business. And before I knew it, I was actually a businessman employing 40 or 50 people with multiple office locations. But then I realized, then I surprised everyone again by sort of taking stock. Well, it was actually, I distinctly remember coming home one day and my wife saying, you're kind of not doing what you enjoy anymore. I was running this sizable business and doing accounts and talking to lawyers and office leases and all this stuff. And I wasn't necessarily helping people the way that I really wanted to help people, the way I got into my career. And it was around that time when I was kind of taking stock and reassessing, this is 20 something years ago now, that the very early seeds of positive psychology just started to sprout. Again, this is, some of Seligman's really early work and some of those really beginnings. But at the time, no one was doing anything about it in Australia, and I got really excited about it. And that's when I set up the Happiness Institute, kind of as a way of saying, look at this fantastic thing. Who else is excited about this? And that then led to the sort of next stage of my career, which has been the last, the focus of the last 20 years of my career, focusing on positive psychology and applications of positive psychology. And it was around that time that, a friend, a colleague called me Dr. Happy as a joke. That started as a joke. And then, long story short, I decided there was some utility in it, that I could use it sort of to get attention. And that's how that came about. I was a bit reluctant to begin with, but I eventually embraced it and used it to try and, as I said, to get start conversations.
Yeah. So for those that aren't aware, what is positive psychology? Because I would imagine there'd be some misconceptions about that term. So could you maybe help them clarify what that actually means?
Yeah, so the simplest way to understand it is, so traditional clinical psychology, as a traditional psychology, essentially focuses on what's going wrong and how can we fix it. So it focuses largely on depression, on anxiety, on distress, on dysfunction, and then how can we treat those things to make people better? And there's kind of always an assumption that if we treat depression, then everything will be fine. But what a lot of people started to realize 20, 30 years ago is that, well, if you take something that's bad and fix it, you just get not bad. You don't necessarily get good.
Interesting.
And so a bunch of psychologists, particularly in the early stages in North America, Marty Seligman, Chris Peterson, Ed Dana, etc., started to sort of ask, well, for so long when they say we psychologists, for so long we've been focusing on what's wrong with people and how to fix it. what if we were to focus on what's right with people and how to make the most of that? So rather than just fixing stress and depression and anxiety, what if we were to foster happiness, thriving, flourishing, real well-being? And that, in very simple terms, led to the development of a new science, in a sense, a new branch of psychology called positive psychology.
So would you say it was more preventative, or is it more enhancing the positive qualities that people already have? My sort of simplistic view would be it's kind of like servicing your car and not waiting for the wheels to fall off. Is that accurate, or would you add anything to that?
Well, it's both of those things, really. So the idea is that if we foster and develop these positive traits and positive attributes, and we build these positive habits earlier, then certainly fewer people will become depressed and anxious. It's not a miracle cure, so we can't completely. I don't think anyone's ever suggested we completely eliminate mental ill health, but certainly it can be a preventative. Like, if we build resilience in children when they're younger, they're less likely to experience things like depression, anxiety, etc. So yes, it's a preventative in that sense, but it is more than that. It's also about enhancing something that clinical psychology never really addressed. So, for example, one of the other metaphors that's often been used is that clinical psychology is kind of like taking people from -10 to 0. So as a clinical psychologist, if someone walked into my office with, let's just say one of the more common things, major depressive disorder. So we might rate their mood on a very simple scale as -9, -9 out of -10. So, that'd be quite severe. My job as a clinical psychologist then would be to try to help them get back to some sort of 0, where they're not depressed.
Right.
But that's essentially where we'd stop. If you walked in the door with serious depression and we would try to provide some sort of therapy, and if you improved so that the symptoms of your depression were no longer prevalent or intense, I would then say, see you later.
So your job is done then.
My job is done when you're no longer depressed. But positive psychology is saying, well, okay, well, that's a good start. Obviously, -10 to 0 is a good start, but why stop there? Why don't we try to go from 0 to +10? Now, no one's going to be at +10 every minute of every day. That's unrealistic. That's absurd. But stopping at 0 is selling people a bit short. It's like saying, well, okay, an absence of depression is as good as it gets. Well, no, that's not the same as real happiness, as true thriving and flourishing. So it goes a lot further than just treating mental ill health.
Wow. That's really interesting. And it would be amiss of me not to ask Dr. Happy this question, but are you happy? And is there an area in your life that you feel like you are either under investing in or you would like to enhance somewhat?
So if I answer that question as in how am I feeling right now, yeah, I'm doing pretty good. It's not a bad day. If I think about that more overall, as I've talked about a lot before, I've actually experienced quite significant mental ill health myself. So I've experienced quite severe depression and anxiety with episodes of quite severe suicidal ideation. So I've definitely been unhappy a lot of my adult life. And that continues from time to time. It ebbs and flows and comes and goes, depending on a range of factors. So am I happy right at this moment? Yep. But generally, or not always. And that's why, so a while ago on my social media, we'll often have Dr. Tim Sharp, aka Dr. Happy, but I've actually changed that to Dr. Sometimes but not always happy. I changed that quite a few years ago because I thought that was a much more realistic descriptor. What am I under investing in? Well, there's a lot of areas of my life I could do a lot better. Just like anyone else, I'm far from perfect. But probably the big one for me that I keep failing in, for want of a better word, is my social connectedness. I have a tendency to isolate and withdraw, particularly when I'm depressed. And that's not necessarily good for me. I've withdrawn from a lot of friendships over the years, and I keep trying and I keep bouncing back, but that's probably, there are other areas I do a lot better in. That's probably something I really need to work the hardest at.
Yeah. And firstly, Tim, thank you for your honesty. I think the more people that have these conversations, especially men, I think it's incredibly valuable. I know that there's been periods in my life that have been extremely hard. And also, I know your work has been truly transformative to me personally. So thank you for putting yourself out there. It makes people like me go, oh, it's actually okay not to have a great day, or it's actually okay to feel a little bit meh today. So thank you for that. I really do appreciate it. Tim, why write Lost and Found? I mean, you seem pretty busy. Like you got a lot of things. You seem like you've got a lot of things going on. So why on earth Have you written another book?
That was a good question. Well, it's good. It's probably easier to answer than it might sound. And the answer is I love writing. I read it. And, I do lots of things, and I've done lots of things over the years. But to be perfectly honest, writing is one of my favorite things. I really enjoy the process. I don't mean to sound immodest, but I found it quite easy when I'm in the flow of writing. And I love the idea. I guess if I go back to my very first book, I don't know, maybe almost 20 years ago now, I can't remember exactly. What really inspired me is that I love the idea of reaching a larger audience. So as a therapist, which again is highly satisfying, and I found thoroughly, I really enjoyed the sense of achievement I got when I was working with individuals and even small groups. But I always kind of knew that there was a limit to the number of people I could see. Even as a busy therapist, if I was seeing, at my peak, I was maybe seeing 6, 7, 8 people a day, 4.5 days a week, whatever. You do the sums, you might be looking at a couple of thousand people a year, maybe over, which is a lot of people, and it adds up. But I always felt, well, not always, but from early on, I kind of had this niggling irritation that it just wasn't enough. And so that was really the first, one of the inspirations to first starting to write, was to reach a larger audience, to get out to people, and also those people who would never walk into my office. I kind of always knew that yes, I can help certain people who walk in, but we've always known there's a whole lot of people who will never see a psychologist or say so a mental health professional. So they just won't ever turn up to a psychologist or psychiatrist or counselor because of stigma or cost or sorts of things. So one of the great things about a book or an audio book, or these days a podcast, I suppose, is you can reach a lot of people and it's much more affordable. And so that was one of the main motivations. But again, I've always loved writing, and I think if I wasn't a psychologist, maybe I would have been a writer. That's one of the only other things I can imagine doing and enjoying. So I've written quite a few of them now. Each time I do it, I say this is probably my last. But then I get a few ideas, a year or two later, another idea pops in. And the idea for Lost and Found, to be perfectly honest, has been brewing for quite a while now. It's probably been sort of simmering in the background for quite a few years. And then it just started to take shape, I guess, maybe, through the last year or two, and get a bit more clarity.
Yeah.
Once it got clear, it sort of became obvious, a bit of a no-brainer.
Yeah, my wife is a writer, so I'm very aware of the emotion and the tears and the frustration and the joy of producing something. And so I'm very aware of that. So I think anybody that can write, like anyone that can write a book is amazing, let alone a good one, which Lost and Found is. I think you should be really proud of yourself. And tell me a little bit about your unsuccessful cricket career, and what did you learn from this?
Well, so one of the things one of the ideas, the central ideas within Lost and Found is the idea that, you need to embrace unhappiness to be happy. You need to get lost to get found. We all fail, but we can learn from that. There's a number of themes along those similar lines. So I actually talk a lot about some of my failures. And this is actually my most personal book to date. There's research there, so there's a lot of science there. There's some practical tips, but there's also, I guess the publishers have called it part memoir. So again, I share some of my personal failures and successes, I suppose. But one of, I suppose, and one of the, and then the lessons I've learned from that. And one of them was that as a young fella, I loved all sport, to be honest. I grew up in my father loved sport. We went to school where sport was kind of, it was considered quite highly. And I loved all sports, but I think cricket was one where for whatever reason, I both loved, but felt I could have been good at. But I was quite good within the context of high school sport. But it became, so I guess the dream as a mid-adolescent was to play for Australia. And this is during Australia's sort of glory days back in that, they were going through quite a good patch. But it really became obvious pretty quickly that I wasn't that good. Well, I was kind of good enough, but nowhere near that sort of level. And that was quite an important lesson, the lesson of perspective, and that if you can fail at something, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because what it then means is, well, what else can I do? What can I move on to? What could I be better at? And eventually, through failing at things, you might find things that you can be more successful at. So yeah, it was a very short-lived dream, but one that again, I think there were some valuable lessons from, as has been from all failures, I suppose.
Yeah, and how do we better embrace failure? Because I am a classic type A personality. I just love going, 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 and I'm not great at embracing when things don't go to plan. I feel like this is a therapy session, so thank you. But how do we get better at embracing failure?
It's a super good question, and I think it's such an important question. And it is really, that's kind of the heart and soul of Lost and Found. But it's one we just don't talk about it enough. And I think, in schools and education, it's vitally important because, well, I'll answer that in a couple of ways. Firstly, I think the first place to start is to recognize the reality that failure is inevitable. And so one of the things I've started asking people is, imagine a life without a failure. Can you imagine never fail? Or think about your kids. Can you imagine if your kids never failed at anything? I don't think any of us could. Or even imagine the sort of life you would have to live and never fail. You basically have to do nothing. And then that would be a failure of a different kind.
Yeah. Or
So
have your expectations so low that you never actually tried to do anything that was beyond your capability, which is awful, I think.
exactly. And so that's a failure of a different kind. So I think the first part of the answer is to recognize that failure is inevitable. The other way to think about it is we're imperfect. We're human beings. So of course we're not going to get it right all the time. And especially if you're going to try new things, and I'm sure you want your kids to try new things. Well, of course, if you try something new, you're not going to be perfect at it the first time, which by definition means you're going to fail. So that's the first thing, is to recognize that failure is an inevitability. But the second part is that that's not a bad thing. Failure is typically used, it has negative connotations. It's typically seen as a bad thing, but does it have to be? I don't think it has to be. I mean, sometimes it will be. But if I ask this question, which I ask, have you ever failed and then learned something from that, which then made you a better, stronger, wiser person? Almost everyone puts their hand up. Of course we have. If you've ever failed and learned from it to become better, well, then is failure actually bad? Not necessarily. There's good within that. It sort of relates to this construct within psychology called post-traumatic growth. It doesn't have to be a trauma, but we can learn from those losses or those failures and become better. So it's an inevitability. It's not always a bad thing. If we accept that and think, well, maybe there's some good in failure, then what we can do is actively approach it in a controlled way. I mean, I'm not necessarily, you don't have to jump in the deep end, but in a controlled way or in a certain way that works for you, so you can use the power of failure to become better.
I love that, Tim. My challenge is I want to do everything at 100%. And some things you don't need to. But I think also on that point, there's some failures that are really catastrophic. I mean, for me, failure as a father, as a parent, is one of those things that I think would be really difficult to bounce back from. But failure as me as a Premier League soccer player is probably not as catastrophic because it's inevitable. So do you have any thoughts on how do we decide what's important and what are some of the things, how do we decide what do we give 100% to, what do we give 80% to, what do we let through the keeper, so to speak? Do you have any thoughts on how we do a better job of that? Because not all things in my life are equal and are as important. That was a very long-winded question, so please pick it apart as you wish.
No, like 100% agree. And I will begin by saying that you're 100% right, that some failures are catastrophic, some are traumatic, and I guess I'm not necessarily talking about them, or maybe that's a sort of separate discussion, I suppose. What I'm talking about are the day-to-day ups and downs that might even be moderate to severely, distressing in a way, but not necessarily life-threatening or catastrophic. Or, well, the other way to think about it, maybe if we think about it in a different context, because given we've both been talking about parenting in a way, because I do write about this in the book. I write about parents who are terrified of their children taking any risks or getting harmed in any way. So there's this idea of, sort of helicopter parenting or overprotective parenting, which I write about in the book. And what we know from the research is that children who grow up in that sort of overprotective environment actually grow up more anxious, less willing to take risks, so less able to achieve successes, etc. Whereas parents who allow their kids to take calculated risks, and I suppose this is the answer to your question, whether it's with our children or with ourselves, you can do it in a sensible way, an appropriate way. Of course, I wouldn't want my children to be hit by a bus or fall off a cliff or whatever.
Yes.
But I do want them to learn how to fall, literally and metaphorically, because if they don't, what sort of life are they then going to live?
Mm.
I suppose, again, whether it's as a parent or whether it's ourselves, I suppose the answer to your question is going about it in a sensible way, stretching our boundaries, taking risks, but carefully so, slowly and gradually. And then coming back to the very first part of your question is having realistic expectations. So putting all of that together, finding the right balance. And as we do that, as we try to find that balance, remembering again that we won't get it right all the time. So allowing ourselves to stuff up when we're trying to allow ourselves to have failures. So and that's when, again, I talk a lot about self-compassion. So being gentle with ourselves throughout all of this is really important.
I love that. And your your chapter about self-compassion or proportion in your book is so important, because I know as a parent it is really hard. As a teacher, it is really difficult, because there are some lessons that you are like, my goodness, this is all going well, this is fantastic. And there are other times that are just really hard. I know in my role, I have a number of I lead a group of teachers, which is an incredible privilege. But there's always someone that's not happy with you. It's either a student, a parent, or a staff member. And so there's all these sort of little micro stresses in the day. And to be honest, sometimes you come home and it's your own kids and your own wife that cops it. And so I loved that chapter about a little bit of self-compassion, and I think is so important. And I always ask my girls, I say, am I a good dad? And they always say, you're a great dad. And sometimes, well, that's the only feedback I need, really, isn't it? From the ones that matter most. But I think taking that time to have a little bit of self-compassion and also give yourself a break, because it's being a grown-up is hard. It's really, really difficult. So that was one of my favorites. Sorry, you were going to say?
Oh, well, no, definitely. Thank you. And, I mean, living life's hard sometimes. And some people have it easier than others, or some people are more sensitive to the ebbs and flows of life than others. But, life's not easy, at the risk of using a cliche. But that's not necessarily the problem. The problem isn't that life's hard. The problem is how we then treat ourselves when we struggle with life's hardships. And many of us are much harder on ourselves. I mean, I'm far more critical of myself than I'd ever be with my kids or with my wife or my friends or my colleagues. And so that's, in essence, what self-compassion is about, is that treating ourselves with the love and kindness that we would treat others. Would you say that to your wife or your kids or a student most of us wouldn't ever say things to other people that we say to ourselves. And, at the end of the day, it's just not helpful. It's not helpful for me to be so critical and so hard on myself, because it achieves nothing of value.
So what do you write, Tim, about why we should help other people find their path? I think that's a really wonderful point, because we're all so busy. We're all trying to do things. I mean, I live in Sydney, which is absolute chaos at times. So why do you think it's important to have enough space to help and to serve other people?
For a couple of reasons. So one of the things I've been saying for years now about happiness. So I talk a lot about happiness, obviously, and a lot of the time I spend a lot of time busting myths and misconceptions about happiness. And one of the things I often say is happiness isn't just feeling good; it's also doing good. There's this kind of a myth that happiness is about me, me, me. Well, it's not. Well, it's not entirely. I mean, I do need to look after myself, and I need to take responsibility for my life, etc., etc. But if that's all I do, then that's selfishness. Real happiness is not just about me; it's about us. I mean, it's particularly about my wife and kids, and then my really good friends, and then my colleague. There's different layers, I suppose. But what we know about the really happy people in the world is that they're not selfish at all. They're more generous, they're more altruistic, they're more giving, they're more caring, etc. So that's one reason. But it's also caring from others is what takes. So if you can think about happiness at a number of different levels. One is happiness is a form of positive emotion. It's a way of feeling good. But and that's important, but that's only fleeting. I mean, all emotions, whether it's happiness or anxiety or contentment or frustration, they come and go. They're fleeting. But that's not really what positive psychology is interested in. Positive psychology is it is interested in positive emotions, but more than that, it's about thriving and flourishing, which is a deeper, more enduring level of, I guess, quality of life or well-being.
Yeah.
And what we know is that to get from that superficial level, which is not unimportant, to the deeper level, one of the things is meaning and purpose and perspective, and that's sort of looking beyond yourself. And so one of the ways to achieve that is to contribute to the lives of others, to volunteer, to careful to, again, to do good in some way or other. And so one of the ways that I've found to do that is to try and help other people learn from my mistakes or learn from my expertise. But, you can do that in all sorts of different ways.
That's really important. And it's almost as if you are, I mean, I've got a full life, as everyone does that's probably listening to this. And there is the argument that you're too busy to help others, but it's almost like you're too busy not to, because it does, I mean, you don't do this, you don't help people selfishly. It's actually really rewarding to be able to serve people. But I love that, actually, that concept of being intentional and taking the time to have that as a part of your week. And you're saying that it's been important for you to share your story so that other people can learn from your challenges and also learn from your successes. And one of the many things I loved about Lost and Found was just how vulnerable it was. And I don't know if I would be brave enough yet to share that much about my own life, but I'm really grateful for you really sort of paving the way in that. So thank you for your generosity. Was it terrifying putting yourself out there in such a way?
No, not really. It's been a long process, so I certainly didn't talk as openly about it when I was younger, but that was partly because no one did back in those days. And
Yeah.
and even if I'd wanted to, I mean, so I'm talking about this is back before Are You OK Day, before Beyond Blue, before a lot of the things we've seen in the last decade or so. So I didn't want to because, like a lot of people, there was a stigma, but also I didn't have the vocabulary, I didn't have the language, and I didn't have the maturity, I think, to even know what I was experiencing myself, let alone explain it to other people. So it's been a long path, and I particularly thank, so I do a lot of work with a youth mental health organization called BATIR, B-A-T-I-R, and that's their reason for being, really. It's about smashing the stigma. So I've learned, they always thank me for helping them, but I've learned more from them than they've got from me, I think. And it was really through the early stages of working with BATIR and seeing how they share lived experiences and share stories and seeing the value in that I started to say, well, look, I'm helping them do it. I really need to get on board myself. And particularly, as you hinted at a bit earlier, I mean, I'm always a bit loath to overgeneralize, but there's no doubt that for males, and I think particularly older males, we need to do more of this. I'm of a generation that came just before a lot of this sharing. So it's even more important, I think. I think it's important for all of us because, the shame and the stigma can't exist in the light. It grows in the darkness. So when we leave it shut away, it gets bigger and scarier. As soon as we let it out and talk about it. And I suppose my hope's always been every time I get on stage and share my story, or when I wrote the book, I think, well, if there's one person out there who reads this or hears this and think, well, I'm not alone. It's okay not to be okay. There is hope. Well, then that's been a success for me.
I love that. And as I mentioned before we hit record, I have had more people come up to me and comment on your episode that we did many seasons ago than any other episode. And so I thank you so much for helping those people that are quietly struggling with some of the things that you talk about. And I love that you're making it part of the everyday conversation, as it should be. So, Tim, when things...
Sorry, I think, and I mean, sorry to go on, but okay. There's some statistics in the book about just how common it is. I mean, if we just talk about the two biggest forms of mental health are depression and anxiety. I mean, there's lots of other things, obviously, but they're the two, the most common forms. If the audience out there is a relatively average audience, then probably about half of them at some stage in their lives will experience depression or anxiety, possibly more. And then even if they haven't experienced it directly, they'll almost certainly experience it indirectly, in that their husband, their wife, their child, their parent, so it's just so common. And even though we've talked about that more recently in the last decade or so, people talk. The other thing that people still don't talk about is suicidality, and that's why I talk about my suicidal ideation, because that's really common as well. Like, why don't we talk about these things? There's this fear that if we talk about it, it will make things worse, and yet the research shows it's just the opposite. Talking about these things only provides benefit and assistance and help. And it's just so important. And I don't necessarily want to be talking about my personal details, but I kind of feel like I have to in this position, and I can, and again, I do know it helps. So
And would you say that feelings like being low or anxiety and depression are part of the body's natural response to traumatic events? What are your thoughts with that? Because I'm very I think it's tempting just to ignore these feelings, and obviously you argue that it's important to embrace them. So, what role do these play in your body's natural healing process?
Yeah, good question. So let me just begin by differentiating between normal human emotions. So
Mhm.
everyone out there at some point will experience what we call negative emotions, sadness,
Yeah.
depression, anxiety, stress, fear, anger, irritation. These are normal. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It just means you're human. And they all actually, many of them serve a useful purpose at times. But I do think we need to differentiate from those normal human emotions, which are appropriate at times, from a psychological diagnosis of
Yeah,
what we
absolutely.
technically call major depressive disorder or one of the anxiety disorders. So there is a difference. Everyone will experience the negative emotions. Not everyone will experience the level or intensity that I and many others
Mm.
experience. So that is important. So is it a normal reaction? Well, yes, it's normal to feel sad sometimes, to grieve, to feel anxious. But it's not necessarily normal for everyone to experience the depths that I experience. It's normal for me. That's for whatever reason,
Yeah, it's a great point.
genetically, biologically, early childhood experiences. That's part of who I am, and I've learned
Yeah.
to accept that to a point. I've learned to accept it and then manage it. But no, not everyone experiences it to the extent
Mm.
that I do, and
Yeah.
good luck.
Yeah, I think that's a thank you so much for clarifying that because I think that's a really important clarification. So Tim, do you have any when things don't go to plan, which is going to be inevitable, as you said, for everyone, what are some of the questions that we can ask to help turn that negative experience into a lesson or a learning opportunity? Do you have any kind of thoughts on how what should that self-talk be like?
Yeah, can I share a sort of anecdote, a story?
Love you to, yes.
So there's a famous story. No one really knows where this first developed, but I've been using it a lot. It's in the book, and I just love it because I think it's a perfect answer to your question. It's a story of a farmer in rural China many years ago. And if there's any listeners from a rural audience, you know that horses or farm animals are often a very important part of their existence. They need, there's particularly years ago before tractors and machinery, horses were, that allow them to live their create their livelihoods and farm the land, etc. Anyway, so the story is about a farmer who had a horse, which is very valuable. And one day the horse ran away. And all the neighbors came around and said, "Oh, that's terrible. What a disaster. You've lost this very valuable horse." And the farmer turned around and he sort of shrugged and said, "Oh, good, bad, I don't know. Maybe we'll see." Um, a few days later, the horse came back and it brought with it 5 wild horses. They all came back together. And all the neighbors came around again and said, "Oh, you've got 5. Remember, these things are really valuable.
Yeah.
How lucky are you? This is fantastic. Gosh, you must be blessed." And he said, "Oh," shrugged his shoulders. "Good, bad, maybe we'll see." A day later, the farmer's son was trying to tame the wild horses. So he's trying to ride them and tame them to make them useful. And as he's doing so, he gets thrown off onto the horse and breaks his leg. The neighbors come around again and say, "Oh my God, this is terrible. Your son, you need your son to help on the farm. He can't, he's useless now with a broken leg, at least in the short term. Well, we're so sorry for you." Uh, Good, bad, maybe we'll see. A few days later, the local militia come around and they take all the young men away they sign them all up to the local army. But they overlook his son because he's got a broken leg, so he's not much use. And they say, "Oh, neighbors come around again. You're so lucky. You haven't lost your son. He's still here to help you."
Mm.
You probably see where this is going to go. Good,
Yeah.
maybe. The lesson we can learn from that, I guess the question is, when things happen, are they really good or bad? Do we really know? Will we really know for a day, a week, a year, or whatever? I guess this ties into mindfulness and but not being judgmental. And I suppose I think part of your question was what question I could ask is, well, could you ask yourself, is this really bad? Is this really good? How will I really know? Or how can I find or make some good out of this bad situation?
Mm. I think that's a beautiful story, and it just speaks about the importance of perspective. I know that there were times I remember when I was applying for leadership positions in schools, and there would have been, oh my gosh, I think I actually I had a folder with all my rejection emails in, and I had to empty it because it got too full, which I think was a low point in my life. Um, but I look back on that moment and think those moments and think I'm actually really grateful I didn't get those positions because it meant that I wouldn't get to work in such an incredible school with amazing people now. And I think that shift of perspective is really, really important. And I know I've so many people sitting in my office that don't get the jobs that they apply for or feel like they've been overlooked for an opportunity. And then I think of stories similar to what you shared and think, well, maybe it's just about perspective. Maybe this is something which wasn't meant to happen. But I really love that story. I have heard it before, and it's one that I tell myself often when things don't quite go to plan. And I was just wondering, Tim, when was the last time that you felt awe and wonder? Because you write about that in your book. So when was the last time you felt that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because it's something that I've kind of been fascinated with this idea of awe for quite a while now. But I guess really started to explore it in the last few years. For those who aren't familiar, it's a word that's used widely, but has a particular meaning within psychology. But for whatever reason, and I'm not quite sure why, it hasn't taken off the way some other constructs have, like hope or gratitude or optimism. Everyone would have heard those things, but not everyone really understands this idea of awe. And yet the research is really quite fascinating. It shows that people that find awe and can see awe on a regular basis are happier. I mean, historically, I'll answer your question directly in a second.
Okay. No, I love it.
Historically, it was something that was, I suppose, associated with religion in a lot of ways for a lot of people, and it still is for a lot of people, or some sort of spirituality. But increasingly, there are many of us who aren't necessarily religious, and so increasingly, nature is an area where people can seek awe. And so for me, that's where I really experience on a regular basis. So for me, well, this book actually. I'm answering this indirectly.
That's okay. I love
the
it.
original, the proposed title for this book originally was called Get Dirty. And it was very much about nature therapy, getting outside, nature therapy, which if you've read the book is still part of it. But when when the publishers accepted it, we started to look into a bit more detail. I think it was actually the marketing department who started to get a bit scared and they thought they might be misinterpreted. And they were probably right. So anyway, we went back to the drawing board because they thought Get Dirty might be a bit controversial in a way. Changed it to Lost and Found. So the nature therapy and the outdoors bit is still there, but rather than being the whole book, it's kind of just one part of it. But anyway, for me, so that's a big part of my mental health program is hiking, camping, getting out in nature. And that's where I most often experience awe. There's something about being in the bush, in the Australian bush, in a forest. There's something about being isolated and away from screens and not having reception and just being hot, being cold, being uncomfortable almost, that for me is really, really therapeutic.
Mm. What is it about nature? Is it a realization just how sort of finite your life is? I say your life, our lives are. Is it an understanding that does it help you put things in perspective? What is it that helps you how does nature help you find that awe?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things I think you've touched on earlier. I think there's definitely a bit of perspective there. And that can work in a couple of ways to see the enormity of nature. So I mean, like you, I live in Sydney, so I spend a lot of time when we're talking about nature, a lot of it's around the Blue Mountains, which for those who aren't know, there's a few hours,
Beautiful.
a couple of hours west of Sydney. And there's another place I go to often, which is just a bit northwest. So, but it's similar sort of land. But to be out in somewhere where you're this tiny, minute, insignificant being in a way, that might sound a bit negative, but it's actually awe-inspiring. There's something about that to almost think I don't matter is somehow kind of liberating, I think. And then to look at those, to look at a gum tree that's maybe been there for 100 years, 200 years, or a rock platform that's been there for thousands of years or whatever. Again, there's something that puts things in perspective. When I look at that and I think of my daily worries, the things that stress me, they can somehow just seem insignificant. But there's a beauty, for me anyway. And I know not everyone enjoys the bush the way I do, but for me, there's this incredible beauty in trees and bushes and rock formations. For other people, it's more the ocean or a lake. I mean, I love the coast as well, but I know might be looking at the ocean or a lake. But there's something majestically beautiful about nature that many of us appreciate, and all of that can create this sense of awe, which is really good for us.
Yeah. I think that's so important, Tim, and it reminds me of I recently got to interview Oliver Berkman, who is a just a sensational individual. I
A
was
great writer.
Yeah, I was surprised that he agreed to the podcast, but also very humble, because for those that aren't familiar, he wrote a book, a very successful book called 4,000 Weeks. And as I approach my almost my 2000th week on Earth, it's definitely put a few things in perspective. And so his argument is, obviously we live sort of roughly 4,000 weeks, which is to be 80. And I remember looking at that title and thinking that is so incredibly depressing. And so I don't know why. Sorry, I don't know why I've got sirens going on. Hang on, I might have to. Okay, I might just jump back into that. So Tim, it reminds me of a book I recently read called 4,000 Weeks, and I had the privilege of interviewing Oliver about a month ago on the podcast. And I originally read that title and thought, oh my gosh, how depressing. I mean, what's the point? We're only alive for 4,000 weeks. But his book is so beautifully written that it reminds us that even that every moment is just truly special, because this is the last this is the only chance we get on this earth. And I think it sort of touches on your point about that idea of awe. And I remember reading that book, and I can honestly say, I think it has changed my life. It's changed the way I interact with people. It's changed the way I hug my kids. And he has this concept in the book called The Last Time. And I believe it's a concept from Sam Harris, who is a incredible writer. Sam, if you're listening, happy to have you on the podcast. But he wrote this idea that everything has a last time. So Oliver said, I don't pick up my kid anymore because he's too heavy, but at some point I used to. And he said, we all have a last time, but we just don't know when that last time is. And that hit me so hard. It caused me to slow down. It caused me to walk with my head held high, to notice things a lot more. And I love that concept when you talked about it. But quite often, uh, insignificance shows us just how significant we are. And I love that. There's nothing quite like getting out into nature and looking around and thinking, geez, this tree's been here for 300 years. It puts things in perspective. So I love that. And I think to those people that are listening, to try and find those ways to experience that awe and that wonder is really important. And Tim, how would you differentiate the two? So you mentioned what awe is, but how do you differentiate that from wonder? Is it the same thing?
Good question. I'm not sure, to be honest,
Yeah.
because I think a lot of these things. So as you were talking, there's a whole bunch of other constructs that came to mind, like
Yeah.
mindfulness and gratitude and appreciation. So
Yeah.
I think these things all relate in different ways. And to be honest, my approach is never well. So I think there is value in pedantically defining a lot of these constructs, particularly in an academic context. So I'm not I'm not opposed to that sort of approach. But because most of my work is sort of more with a general public audience as opposed to an academic audience, I don't mind too much if people sort of interchange these words at times. So, I guess I'd say awe and wonder as part of the same family in a way. And even, again, even gratitude comes into that, or
Yeah.
elevation is another one. Or
Yeah.
I don't think it really matters so much as long as we're exploring and finding things that work for us, finding ways that we can live good lives. That's
Right.
all that really matters at the end of the day.
That's really, really important. And I just have a couple more questions. I do want to be respectful of your time. I'm so grateful that you'd chat to me today. Um, what do you think our relationship should be with productivity and achievement? Because it seems, as I said, I'm a type A personality. I like to get things done, but how should we begin to approach those things?
It's a great question, and like you, it's one that I've sort of, I guess, struggled with, and struggled with over the years, and one that I probably did have an unhealthy relationship early on. I mean, I talk about in the book how for me, as a younger person, particularly, and still to some extent today, because I had such low self-esteem, I was so self-critical, and I thought the way to feel better would be to achieve more and more and more. So, completing a degree wasn't enough. I had to go into another degree and then another degree. Writing a book wasn't enough. I had to write another book. And what I found is that it's just a never-ending process. You never get there. I guess my answer to that question is achievement and accomplishment is important. For those of you who are familiar with Seligman's work, his PERMA model, the A in PERMA is achievement or accomplishment. It is actually important. It's a part of living a good and happy life. But, and I guess this is the other part of the answer, it's not everything. It shouldn't be seen as everything. So along with achievement and accomplishment, which are good things, we also need to balance that with other aspects of living a healthy life. We need to, so for example, there's no point achieving and achieving and achieving if you neglect your physical health and well-being. If you never exercise, you don't get enough. So, you won't be able to keep it up. Eventually, you'll crash down. There's no point in achieving an accomplishment if you neglect your social relationships or your family. You go, and again, I coached many people and worked with many people earlier in my career who were highly, quote unquote, successful, earning lots of money, high status jobs, but they didn't know their kids. Their relationship with their wife fell apart. Now, is that real success?
Great question.
So I guess that's the answer to your question is achievement and accomplishment are great, as long as you're not neglecting the other important areas of your life, health and well-being, meaning and purpose, charity and volunteering, giving, et cetera, et cetera. So it just needs to be seen as one part as opposed to the whole picture.
Yeah. And what are some of those orange flags in your life that you start to go, okay, things are a little bit out of balance here. I need to look at some of my commitments or my priorities. What are some of the things that you start to notice and you start to change before they become serious?
Well, I'll preface this by saying that everyone's different. So, red flags, orange flags, whatever you call them, they'll be different for different people. So my red flags, orange, will be different to yours. But we all have them, and it's a really, really good question because the earlier on you can pick them up, the easier it is to then remedy. Too often, I think many of us wait till they're blazing red, and you can still do something then, but it gets a lot harder. Or the other metaphor I sometimes use is that if you think of a pot of boiling water. Most of us wait till our pot's just boiling, it's just raging, and then we try to do something about it. But if you go back in time, you'll notice that a pot of boiling water doesn't go from 0 to boiling in one go. It starts off with tiny swirling dots, and it'll swirl, and then the bubbles get a bit bigger, and then they get bigger and faster. And so if we can get in at those tiny swirling dots just at the beginning, it's a lot easier than the raging boiling water. So what are they for me? Well, for me, poor sleep is an indicator that I'm stressed or worried. My sleep can be very easily affected. It's one of the first things that goes when when my mood's not good. Irritability, snapping at loved ones. These are quite common ones. It used to be if I would stop my exercise routine, but now I'm pretty good at. I'm pretty diligent. I just don't let that stop really, unless I'm sick or injured or something or other. But normally, if you're not doing the things that are important to you, or if you're doing things that are harmful for you, then that's probably an indicator. And the more mindful and aware you are, again, the earlier you can pick up on them and the earlier you get in, usually the easier it is to take some positive action.
Fantastic. And last question, if you don't mind, Tim, the majority of people listening to this are teachers. They are either directly or indirectly responsible for young people. What advice would you give them in terms of helping their students to become more resilient and more active and productive members of society?
Let them get lost so they can find themselves.
Love that.
Failure is not a bad thing. It's not bad. Don't expect them to know everything. I mean, I'm sure a lot of the teachers would know this already, but I think, and again, I think in our education system, and I'm probably preaching to the converted here, and you guys in your audience would know even more about this than me, but I think our education system doesn't do a good job of embracing failure. Again, failure is seen as a bad thing. And I'm not saying we want to encourage kids to fail, but we shouldn't demonize it either, within reason. I think if we want people to learn, we want children to learn, they've got to try new things. If they try new things, they won't be perfect at it. We don't need to be perfect. Life's not perfect. So I guess I get, in a roundabout way, embracing imperfection, embracing failure, using that as opportunity. I mean, it's not just about failing for failing's sake, but using it as an opportunity to learn more about ourselves, to become better, to gradually grow and improve. I hope that answers your question in a roundabout way.
It sure does. And I am so grateful that you would take the time to talk to me today. It's been a real joy just to see just to see you again and also to read your book. It's a huge privilege. And I know that there are so many people out there that would really get so much from this incredible work. So I'll make sure I put a link to that in the show notes, and also a link to the ways that people can reach out to you. But Dr. Tim Sharp, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you again. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. Great chat. Thanks.
Thank you.